Greetings traveler, I'm SnapJelly and I'm very sweaty, but I'm in Brazil, so don't judge me. A while ago on Facebook, I saw a discussion talking about, somebody asked why people in HEMA used faders instead of using longsword blunts, or why we would use faders instead of longsword blunts. Now, what's a fader? What's a blunt? In case you don't know, this is a Federschwert. This is typically what people use for longswords when people practice longsword in HEMA, and this is a longsword blunt. It's basically a longsword which is blunt. Now, there is a difference between the words blunt and dull, which I should shortly mention. Something is dull when it was sharp but is no longer sharp. So aka you buy a knife, you use it for 10 years and never sharpen it and now it doesn't cut anymore. That's dull, right? Something is blunt when it is not sharp, never was sharp, and is not supposed to be sharp. Something like a baseball bat is blunt, or longsword blunts are blunt. Swords that are made for reenactment, usually is what I usually say, are blunts. So why would people use faders instead of using longsword blunts? Because you would, if you would try to recreate sword fighting using something that's more accurately represents the weapon that you're supposed to be fighting with, should be more accurate, right? In a way, yes and no. There are several reasons why people use faders instead of blunts. I wonder if this video will get demonetized because I say blunt so much. I should say swords, right? Faders are swords too, but this is a sword. Why do people use faders instead of normal swords? Well, one of the main reasons is basically because faders are safer, in a way. If you look at the edge right here, faders are usually fairly chunky swords, fairly thick swords. They don't look thick like that, but I don't have anything to measure it, but the edge here is like half a centimeter thick, something like that. Whereas the edge on this sword is, well, it's not a lot thinner. I don't know how well you can see it, but it is not sharp, but it is quite a thin edge. Whereas this, is a lot thicker, right? So a thicker edge means more surface area when you hit something, and that makes it safer. And most of the times, faders are generally thicker than longsword blunts. However, I must say that not all blunts are made equally. This one, for example, not a longsword blunt, is compared to the other one a lot thicker. It is still a little thinner than my fader, but it is just overall thicker and overall safer in that regard. Now, a lot of problems with longsword blunts that I personally find have to do with the wide variety of longsword blunts that are out there. They're not all the same quality, and they all differ very much. Now, I got these two on purpose because these are both regulated swords, the fader and the longsword. They're both the same dimensions, the same grip length, the same blade length. So this one turned out to be a tad bit shorter, right? They're the same weight as well. This one is a little bit heavier, but it's almost negligible. And there are some key differences in these swords. Now, I have full contact sparred with both. There is difference in handling in both. In using different swords as well, different faders and different longswords as well. I can say that there is a slight difference in usage of faders versus longsword blunts in my experience, although it's quite hard to describe. One of the main problems that I had with full contact sparring with this is the primary concern, of course, is safety. Not only the edge, like I just said, is a problem, but also the tip. As you can see, it's not sharp, it is rounded, right? It's not pointy. But if you compare it to the tip of the fader, right here, this is what's called a rounded tip. It is a little circular ball that is forged like that, right? A lot of schools also require you to tip your sword separately, which means that you put a rubber or some kind of cap on top of this as well to make it even safer. None of the schools that I've been to require to do this. I also don't like it very much because tips often tend to fly everywhere, but that's a discussion for another day. Regardless though, this larger ball at the end obviously makes it safe to use. If something is more pointy, has less surface area, it stings more if you stab someone with it. So I've done full contact sparring with this sword, and I can quite safely say that if I use this sword, I am more careful than I am with the fader. If I want to do full contact hard sparring, I will always pick my fader. Another mosquito. Where is it?
I don't know.
Okay, anyway. No, gosh, I saw him! Motherfucker. There he is, bitch. Did I get him? Squeezing. No. This is the video now. It's SnapJelly hunting a mosquito. They're trying to get me while I'm distracted filming for you guys. They never bite her. They only bite me. Because I'm more delicious. Ha. And more sweaty. As I was saying, blah blah blah, something about safety. For example, if somebody uses a light sparring jacket, I will probably not use this sword. Quite simply because the thinner edge, less surface contact, makes it so that a hit from this sword stings more. And there's also stories and things like that of blunt longswords still being able to cut quite well, and they're cutting through material quite a bit, so you have to be very careful with these things. I'm comfortable sparring with this quite simply because I fight quite defensively. I don't really hit very hard. I'm pretty relaxed in sparring as well, and also maybe it's a part that I'm used to. When I started, we kind of just used anything on anyone, any combination of weapons with varying amounts of protective equipment, and just hit each other, which I don't condone very much. I wouldn't necessarily do it anymore now, but anyway, I did do quite a lot of that. So I'm quite accepting toward most materials, although I do have a certain preference and a certain limit for safety, of course. This sword, while in handling and dimensions and weight and things like that, it is the same as my fader. It is, because of the point and the edge geometry, not as safe as the fader. And that's why I wouldn't use it. Or at least I would use it calmly with somebody I trust, with somebody that has adequate equipment, something that I would consider adequate equipment, and of course I would talk to them about it. Now, this sword, for example, is unusable for different reasons, because it has a thicker edge, but this example has a guard that is more pointy, which is dangerous in of itself. And even if you exclude punching with the sword, if you wouldn't do that, there's still some danger in that. You can still certainly hurt yourself with that, or your opponent on accident, things like that. So swords have these kinds of things, different kinds of details that make them safer or less safe. I want to argue semantics a little bit here, and did I get him? I don't think I got it. I want to argue about the word fader, because generally when people talk about a fader, what they mean is this. And most of the time when people talk about a fader, what they mean is this. But I'll give you a scenario. Let's say that you have a longsword, which has the same weight as a fader, the same amount of flexibility as a fader. It also has a rolled tip. It just doesn't have a shield. It doesn't have this part, which is what a lot of people see as a defining part of the fader. Would that be a longsword blunt, or would that be a fader? Well, personally, I would still be more inclined to call that a fader than a longsword blunt. Well, technically it would be somewhere in the middle, but I don't think that having a shield defines something as being a Federschwert, because there's a lot of difference in type of shield. You have this one that kind of points up, you have straight ones, you have very small ones that kind of angle down in this way. So just a sword having a shield, does that make it a Feder? To me, that's kind of weird. I don't think Feder should refer to this general shape. A Feder should be a sparring safe HEMA sword. And this is the shape what most people go with, but in my opinion it's not necessary. If someone would have this exact same sword without the shield, to me that would still be a Feder, even though it would officially be kind of in between. So from that perspective, should you spar with longsword blunts? It depends on the sword really, because I have seen Feders that, to me they're fine to spar with, but I'm sure would not pass some safety regulations of some schools. Either they're too stiff, or they have pointy bits on the guard, or the material is too weak and like it gets damaged easily, or even just simply the edge being not rounded. So if you look at it from this kind of angle, it will be square. So the edges like that, they can cut still. They rake open stuff and things like that. I've seen Feders like that as well. So from that perspective, I wouldn't say that a Feder is safer than a longsword one. The problem is that if you get a Federschwert from a smith that you know, if you get like a regular Feder, you know what that's gonna do. You know how that's gonna perform, pretty much, right? There's a lot more longsword smiths out there that produce longswords that have just varying quality, and even not even necessarily talking about quality, just they function differently, they handle differently, they're made differently, they're just different quality, different viewpoints, different things that the smith found important, basically. And there are very good smiths out there that don't fight themselves. So they can create beautiful things, but they don't know the small details that make a sword safe or not safe or things like that. And a main problem that smiths encounter is when they want to reproduce a authentic sword, or a sword that they've seen on a picture somewhere, or a sword from a museum. Let's say you find a sword in a museum, whatever sword it is, this sword in a museum, and this sword is obviously dull, not blunt. It's dull, it was sharp. Now it's not sharp anymore, but it is supposed to be sharp, so it has this thickness, just as an example, it has this thickness. Now, I want to make a reproduction of this sword, but a dull one, no, a blunt one, that's what I mean. A blunt one, for fighting purposes, for HEMA, for reenactment, for whatever, so people can use it, right? So I want to recreate this sword. Now, if you look at the edge from this angle, right? On the authentic one, the one in the museum, the edge is gonna have this shape. It's pointy. Even if it's not sharp anymore, it is pointy because it's supposed to be sharp. Now, if I want to make that safe for usage in reenactment or HEMA or anything, I'm gonna have to make that round, like this, right? So that point, I'm gonna have to shave off a bit of that point in order to make it round, like that, right? But all of a sudden, if I do that, if this sword was sharp and I shave off a bit of the material to make it dull, my blade is gonna be smaller in this direction than the original was, which in a lot of swords can look kind of stupid. So I look at my reproduction and I look at the original one and I'm like, this is not what it looks like. It looks weird. It's too skinny, it's thin, it's weird. So a lot of times what happens is, instead of shaving off a bit and making the sword dull like this, what happens is they add material here to make it square. They add material so that the sword is, if you look at it from this perspective, from the profile, it is the same width as the original, right? But it is dull, so it's not sharp, so it's safe. Problem is, this adds material to it, more material than the original had, making it heavier, making it hit harder, basically. So there's a weird balance. If it looks exactly like the original, then it's going to be heavier than the original and it's going to hit harder. If it doesn't, it's going to, if it is skinnier, then it will be safer, but it doesn't look quite like the original. And then there's an in-between where it is dull, but not quite as dull. So you shave off as little as you possibly can, and it's not sharp, but still the edge is quite thin, so it still leaves quite a sting if you hit with it. If you hit wrong with it or right with it, whatever way you cut it, it can still actually cut you. So there's no right way to do it. No matter what, there's no right way to do it. And that's why these things are difficult. A lot of people also have something, what I can only really describe as a distorted idea of what a sword is supposed to be. And this is a difficult, tricky topic because there is no real answer to what a sword is supposed to be. A sword can be a lot of things. Like if a sword is overly heavy and clunky and thick and weird, is it all of a sudden not a sword? No, it is still a sword. So it's just what generally I and a lot of other people would call a bad sword. And what I'm trying to say is, I've met people who were in the sword industry, in the business or whatever you would call it, for a lot longer than me, for several years before I even started, who grabbed my Regnier longsword, this one, felt it, and said that they've never felt a longsword this good, this comfortable, this light. It was kind of weird to me because there's nothing wrong with this sword, but you need to create a spectrum of what a sword can be. A sword can be a lot of different things, and if somebody grabs a sword like this sword and says, "I've never felt a sword this good," specifically using those words, what that implies to me is that swords that they are used to, or what they have in mind what a sword should be, is overly heavy or just awkwardly balanced, or a combination of a lot of things. Are those swords necessarily bad? Well, no. It depends on what you want to do with them. If you do HEMA, like most people do HEMA, like Longsword, and basically it's supposed to represent unarmored sword fighting, right, in modern HEMA gear, then a big, heavy reenactment sword is probably not the right way to go. Some people prefer heavier swords. I would argue that generally more people would benefit from using lighter swords most of the time, but again, that will be a topic for a different video. So ultimately, let's put an end to this. What's the verdict? There is no verdict. To me, using a longsword blunt is fine for HEMA, but you have to look at the specific sword, just like you have to look at the specific fader if you use a fader. Just because it's fader shaped doesn't make it safe to use, doesn't make it a good sword to use. There's a lot of difference in these things. I will say though that, however, if you use the longsword blunt, there are a lot of longsword blunts on the market that are not safe enough. They're too stiff, they're too pointy, they're too heavy, they have an edge that's too thin. There can be a lot of things wrong with these things. They can have pointy bits here or there or whatever, and you might not think about these things, you might not see these things as a problem, but they are a problem. They can be a problem, and you don't want them to become a problem, because a problem indicates somebody's broken finger, or you accidentally stabbing through somebody's protective gear and actually piercing their body. And of course these are accidents, but these accidents happen, and you need to do as much as you can to try and prevent these things, of course, within the realms of reason. The sport that we practice, in my opinion, is a dangerous one regardless. We practice a martial art, which requires, if you want to become good at it, it requires a lot of sparring. It requires a lot of hard sparring, and sparring for HEMA indicates hitting each other with bars of iron. There's no real way around it. You have to do that. So you have to always look at the equipment that you have, not only the swords, but also your protective equipment, and you have to look to yourself and your training partners to keep everybody safe and keep everybody happy. And that's basically what I would say. So, from my perspective, check your equipment no matter what it is, if it's a fader or a blunt or something in between. Check its flexibility, check its weight, check how big the edge is, check if it has sharp parts, check if it has pointy bits, check everything. Be safe. And when it's safe, beat the shit out of each other. So, if you stuck around this long, you might subscribe. Also follow me on social media, links are in the description below. And thank you for joining my quest, and I hope you'll join me in the next one. I wanted to start a series, sort of, maybe, possibly, about getting back into shape.